Good morning, everyone. My name is Asheesh Raina, and I'm a principal research analyst based with Gartner Mumbai office. So today I'm going to present you with slightly different, yet immensely interesting topic of open source. How it evolved over a period of time and how it is going to impact our IT in the next 4 to 5 years. I'm also going to present you with few things which we think as an IT practitioner you must know about open source. And also, if you are in a stage where you are either evaluating or you are totally indifferent towards open source, still you need to know this. This all started way back in 2006 when Gartner made a very bold predict saying that by 2012, 75% of global 2000 organizations are going to include open source in their mission-critical portfolio. It's a very bold predict, I must say once again. Reason, we are talking about the mission-critical portfolio, and the 75% is a large percentage which really will be going forward for it. 6 years later, sitting here today, it amuses us to no extent that how right we were. Driven by the same fact, we are compelled to update our prediction by saying that by 2015, 99% of global 2000 organizations are going to include open source in mission-critical portfolio. The cascading effect is not taken into account in this prediction. We're leaving it for imagination. These are few of the key issues which we'll be touching during this presentation. I go back to my prediction of saying that 99% of global 2000 organizations are going to use this. But why is this important to me and to all? Because every prediction has an outcome. And outcome knows no bias. It impacts everyone equally, be as an analyst or a consumer or a provider. Everyone in the ecosystem is treated equally by the prediction. The first and the foremost and the no-brainer outcome of that prediction is open source is simply unavoidable. Come what may, it is a force to reckon with. Sooner or later, you have to have some interface with the open source. Open source had been into existence for the last couple of years, where it became so pervasive that most of the mainstream IT organizations could no longer afford to ignore it. And the ones we tried placed them on a significant risk of technical failure and legal nightmares. Open source also has multiple entry points in your organization today. One of the reasons is it is low barrier for cost of adoption and low cost of entry. Imagine a scenario where your users and programmers are literally a click away from downloading thousands and thousands of open source solutions which are there available. They lie undiscovered in your organization, and they start getting heavily leveraged by multiple businesses within your organization. It doesn't stop here. Even when we buy a commercial software, 85% of commercial software today has some open source component embedded inside. When you don't know it, we do not realize that we are still having some interface with open source. There is a third-party element also. So whenever we go for any kind of outsourcing, offshoring, any other model where we have contracted third-party services, that becomes a potential source of open source to again enter into your organization. A mini takeaway here is that assume that you already have some open source sitting inside your organization. All you need to do is think about leveraging it. The second important step is that if I want to leverage it, I need to know what it is. And how do I differentiate it with the very similar looking solutions which I have already seen? By the acquisition and distributing dynamics, I realized that they all can be clumped together. The public domain software, shareware, very similar to open source. But there is a lot of difference between each. If you look at public domain software, it works very similar to open source, where you can download it without any obligation. You can modify the code, and you can use it for any given purpose. But it doesn't have an owner. And when you do not have an owner, you do not have any copyright issues, which further means one can use it for any given purpose and is under no obligation to revert it back to the community because there is no owner. However, open source is a very, very properly licensed software. It is usually owned by an individual, group of individuals, or a larger gathering as a community. It also sits on a very tight copyright and intellectual property rights. Depending on the terms and conditions, you are also required to contribute back to the community with the derived works you have done. In that case, it is very similar to shareware or a freeware. Shareware is a very licensed software. It can have a copyright. It is also dealing with the IPRs. However, you cannot use it perpetually because they work on the principles of use before you buy or try before you buy, usually for the 30, 60, 90-day trial period. So once those days are over, it gets expired. While as in open source, you can use it perpetually. The point what we are trying to drive here is that recognition of open source is extremely important. And when at the back end you are trying to do an inventory of your software assets, you need not clump all of them together. They all need to be treated separately, especially open source, which has a high unique proposition. There is another perception or impression which we very often get with open source because it has open source, open standards. Very often than not, we presume both the things are same. At the back end, as an IT mythology, if I'm allowed to call it, I would want to be open. It works on the same principle of openness and transparency, but still they are not same. So whenever I acquire open source, I presume I am doing it for the larger good. I am doing it because it is open standards. In open standard, there are few things which get seeped into from the regional variations. So there are regional bodies which treat them differently. Even from the vendor's perspective, the open standards may change from time to time. While as in open source, it is universally unique. Everything remains same under one particular license. It is again a very important point for me to recognize, purely because I need to have a separate roadmap for it. And especially we have established the fact that it is going to be unavoidable. I need to take an inventory of it, and I also need to separate them out, purely from the IT architectural roadmap, which I'm going to create at the back end within my organization before I start using them. Now, since we assume that we know what is the difference between other similar looking software assets and the open source, we also need to evaluate open source for certain finer points. The most important point is freedom and choice. And the success of any open source implementation hinges very heavily on these 4 degrees of freedom. Freedom to run the software anywhere, anytime, on any device. Freedom to study the code and modify it for any given purpose. By the way, all this without any obligations. Freedom to redistribute the existing copies which are made available by the open source community. And freedom to distribute the copies of my derived works to any number of people at any given point of time. The proponents of open source maintain that these are exactly the finer points in open source that allows you to derive high quality software assets at a cost which is phenomenally low compared to any other alternative. The mini takeaway here is, when we are looking at open source, we need to evaluate them on these degrees of freedom. Because these are the points which distinguishes open source from others. But that is not all. There is a perception that open source has a very, very high quality code. It comes from a very philosophical and human fact that when we are inside some system, we become blind to it. We take things for granted. That is why the practice of peer review or somebody else vetting what you have done is usually adopted by the organization. Since this is a community development where diversified set of programmers and the coders and developers are developing a solution in open source, there is a general tendency to assume it has a very high quality. If we are comparing that with the alternatives, we also need to realize that success of open source hinges on community as well. The transparency of code, the defect tracking, the planned production, and the robust intellectual property rights. So the notion of that you cannot maintain a mediocrity through obscurity do not hold for a very long time. Having said that, it does not mean the software quality is poor. And we also assume that the weaker code will die because open source communities do not have a might to propel it forward with the lack of finance, which could be possible in closed source. Though these are nice impressions, philosophies, and things which we have a very hard-wired impression, but not always true as per the Gartner research. The fact is, there are a lot of factors which are very intrinsic to the organization. If you are having an open source project and you're not dealing it the same way as you would have dealt any other closed source project, it will fall flat. There is requirement of a very strong project governance which has to come from you. There is a requirement of a best practices which has to come within an organization. And if you do not have these two, then you cannot take it granted that open source is going to fly off. Again, one of the advice that as a model, do not assume that it is a high quality or a low quality. There are a lot of things which as an organization we also need to invest in for the success of it. Similarly, it holds true otherwise. Very often than not, the kind of scenario we have today regarding the threats, the scanners, vulnerability, we presume that open source is not equipped enough to handle it. It's a very, very, very specialized stream which only large vendors today can offer. They can invest on protection of their software, whereas open source community lacks the bandwidth. Again, it is not true. It falls back on the initiative of an organization behind the firewall, that what are the kind of best practices you already have. And again, from the Gartner perspective, the effective security comes within the organization or not through the solutions. They are as safe, as secure as any other closed source alternative which is available today. So when we are evaluating open source for our organization, we need to consider these facts. But we are still not done yet. For evaluation, we also did not use arbitrary preferences. The general impression is open source is very ethical. Why is it ethical? Because the code is provided to me. Why is it ethical? Because I'm under no obligation to use it and distribute it. But within Gartner, again, the surveys and the research we have done, we presume that it is really not true. If we are ignoring the fitness of purpose, and we are basing our business case and selection criterion for open source based on these arbitrary ad hoc basis, more emotional ideologies, we are bound to fail. 100% of the time, I must add that. So if open source is a clear-cut choice, go for it. But do not ever, if it is not a clear-cut choice, do not go for it. But do not build a business case purely based on whether open source is ethical or not. So if we try to combine the point number 4, which starts from the high-quality code, more security, and ideology, we realize that it has to match with the governance. It has to match with the reality. It doesn't need to feed on the impression. Open source is not owned by any, as we try to understand that it's a larger community which holds it. There is no single entity which has elusive control on it. The immediate outcome is it decouples from the vendor control. And the immediate outcome is that as an organization, I don't have to pay for the privileges of using open source. This also further means at some point of time, I can control my commercials. I can decouple from the vendor services and start doing it all by myself, maybe taking on the technical part or developing it, trading, skills, legal indemnification. But these are something which is again very intrinsic for an organization, whether I have a bandwidth of doing it or not, or whether I have an IT team which can really happen to do that. In that cases, the third party comes into picture, which can take care of all the things, starting from the legal repercussions, indemnifications, development, and the best practices. But having said that, it is again a beauty of open source, which allows you this control. Think of a scenario where you want to decouple from a vendor and still go ahead in a closed source scenario. It is highly, highly difficult, impossible sometimes. A mini takeaway that these are the fine points where you can decouple from the vendor and you can make it your own is something which we need to keep into high consideration while looking for any kind of open source solution. ROI is something which is not very close to open source only. Even in closed source, we talk about ROI. So why there is a differentiation between that? If I'm not achieving any particular ROI, open source is no good. The point what I'm trying to drive here is that calculating an ROI is an art and a science because they work with multiple models within your organization. Excuse me. So despite the fact that open source sits inside your organization and is leveraged by multiple businesses, it is very difficult to calculate the accurate ROI. And they also vary a lot. Assuming same solution, same set of people, but in a different scenarios, they will have a different output. I get back to my same point, that if we are looking at open source, from the ROI perspective, we need not have a very blanket expectations that every time I use open source, I'm going to get this much of a return. They will keep on varying. They will depend on your project governance. They will again depend on your best practices. And they are very, very closely associated with the kind of practices you have in your organization. Within Gartner, we have observed that you can always save with open source, but only if you have best practices to go along with. This is based on the kind of surveys which we had done in the past, where lots of organizations, they went with the expectation that we are going to achieve so much of ROI, and when they didn't, they deemed open source as a failure. But in reality, it was a failure of the organization, not for the inherent model of open source. To begin with, open source offers you a head start by no acquisition cost. Ideally, it should give you a quick ROI, and the longevity of ROI should also be low. But why we feel that every time it cannot be a success? Because it requires to be very, very closely tracked and followed and audited. The same point we are trying to reiterate once again, that there is quite a bit of difference between expectation versus reality. So usually our expectations are extremely high when it comes to open source. Open source is like a child. If you don't speak to them, it's like an employee. If you don't speak to them, if you don't treat them well, they are not going to treat you well as well. So why we have a little less interest in open source is because it comes almost free of cost. We also sometimes toil hard with the ROIs because the CapEx need to move to OpEx. So some bookkeepers do not like that fact. But in reality, 87% of respondents said that they are expecting a phenomenally high ROI when they implemented the open source project. Over a further subsequent discussions, and when we met them after some period of time, we realized that only 50% could make it. So this differentiation is purely because of difference in the expectation versus the reality. So I'm not placing my reality with respect to ROI. And I think it is also an art which will come with respect to time until we get used to open source. And we realize that how it really works and what is the kind of expectation I should have when I move on to further the projects. Open source represents both the danger and the benefits. When the open source is sitting inside your organization, as we said, that assume that will be inside your organization, they lie undiscovered and sometimes unaudited and unmanaged, and they pose a significant risk, and they are like a ticking time bomb. And if they still remain unmanaged, they can pose a significant risk to your business values, technical failures, and the IPs. However, if you are able to manage it well through the governance which you would be having in place, you can manage it for the flexibility, innovation, and the cost optimization. The flexibility of creating any solution which you would not have any ready-reckoning solution available as of now. You can use it for innovating because it is going to address the pain points which otherwise would not be possible. And the cost optimization is something which you get with respect to time. When you get used to the software, you used to know that what are the do's and don'ts, and you form a doctrine around it. The final point is look for both advantages and disadvantages when we are evaluating it. Again, I come back to the open source governance. It's a very simple equation of ROI, but it requires to be managed with a very strong governance from you. So the point again and again which I'm reiterating and trying to drive is that as an organization, you really need to invest a lot of efforts, bandwidth, and energy. Otherwise, it will fail like any other closed source alternative as well. While as in open source, if you manage it well, you have a very high chances of making it profitable and overall success. That is why you need to have a governance program which can act like a mini center of excellence, if I am allowed to call it, which can address some of the issues which we have listed, where you can create a defensive strategy towards the worst case scenario, or where you can leverage a competitiveness by building a solutions which can only adhere to your processes or the unique processes you have. And then it will enable you to pose a significant innovations over a period of time. This is one of the favorite slide of Gartner, and it is called hype cycle. If you look at this hype cycle, you realize there is a whole lot of technologies which are embedded. It is difficult to read. But the point we are showing is that open source is not a technology in itself, but it is present in almost all the software segments. This is for 2010, by the way. The one on the left-hand side are the budding technologies, which means they have just started. They are very, very emerging. On the right-hand, extreme right-hand side are the ones which are highly mainstream. By mainstream, I mean these are the ones which are going to be very easily incorporated for any mission-critical portfolio usage. And in between is the hype, where it goes to a hype, everybody talks about it, nobody uses it. And then there is a series of failure where we have failed testimonials just because there was a hype and everybody wanted to use it for the heck of it. And then comes a point where only the serious users tend to use it. So this is easier. So this is what we are trying. So this is the entire life cycle of any technology which you can move it like this. At the bottom, you can see that how long will they take to become mature. Even I can't see that. Anyways, so the point what I'm trying to tell you is there is a whole lot of open source in all the technologies, and it is totally flooded. And we had a bandwidth, so we could not cover all. And on the left-hand side is more risky and the less risky. Now I move to 2012, and you will realize there are a lot lesser open source technologies. The reason is either consolidation, or the reason, more important, is that most of the technologies have moved out of this plateau. And they are mainstream enough to be used for any kind of mission-critical circumstances. And this also forms the basis that's why we say that 99% of organizations are going to use it. The point of comparing these two slides is that none of the open source technology is stationary. They all are moving, they all are getting matured, and they all are getting ready to be used within the mainstream. Another beauty here is, on the left-hand side, I'm still getting a new technology which are still emerging. They are still knocking doors in cloud, in big data, in mobility, and social media. So when you are associated with open source, it is kind of very comforting that I'm not with a technology which is going to be obsolete or which is going to be stationary and not moving with the respect of time. There's another thing which we need to be careful while evaluating open source for is that there are a lot of vendors and the providers which say we are open source company, but the true essence of open source comes either you do it directly or if you are having a third party to do it. You need to engage with and sponsor the open source projects and solutions. It requires a whole lot of engagement from you. The next step would be to integrate your product and services. Then embed your OSS in products and services and directly communicate with the larger OSS community. If you cannot do it, but if you are selecting your vendor, they should be able to do it. So your vendor selection criterion could be the ones who are doing this for you or on your behalf. So in the long term, this is the path which actually is going to be followed and make any open source as a successful implementation. This comes out as an immense relief for the entire ecosystem, both from the provider side and both from the vendor side and the consumer side. This is an open core, dual licensing. It has emerged to be a very popular one of late. In this, vendor enjoys a very tighter control on the IP. In fact, it virtually owns everything. And this is required for on-ramping free customers to the paid versions. This also allows vendor to give a high contracted SLAs, which some customers pose as a concern to fight any other alternative. Because of this, vendors are able to carefully craft a very strong coded and thus attest the quality of the software as well. From the consumer perspective, it still gets you all what you want, a very, very high quality, where the core functionalities are differentiated between the paid and the free version. And yet you have everything which is possible to do in open source, distribution, for example. So far, within Gartner, we haven't found any particular fault in this approach. It has really worked well for the entire ecosystem. The customers have moved from free to paid versions. The vendors are able to attest what they are delivering. And the scenario is entirely made competitive because now they can offer a higher contracted SLAs with a very high productivity. This is again the licensing part of it, and there is no single license in open source. There are dozens and dozens of them. Most of them conform to the minimum definition of open source as put forth by open source initiative community. But the majority of them are using within these 20. So as an end user organization, it is important for you to evaluate the kind of licensing you are getting to get associated with. Some of the licensing agreements work well for education, or some have a drawback that they cannot be integrated together, or you cannot distribute it if it is commingled with any other software, any closed source software. So there are different terms and conditions which probably requires to be evaluated before you get into a large-scale deployment of open source. So look for the licensing agreement which fits you well. So look for the nature of deployment which you have, depending on which you can choose the licensing agreements. The final point, which as an IT practitioner you must know, is that open source is evolving like any other technology, like any other closed source technology. We attested the fact by showing you the hype cycle, where they were in a continuous movement. Similarly, as we go ahead, we realize because of diversification, these are going to be stretched. They are now being used in some of the emerging verticals, which probably would not have been touched earlier. Now, because of this diversity, there is a lot of changes which are going to happen in the ecosystem. It is going to create maybe a 3 segments, where one will be a very, very traditional one, the open source community. It will be a community-driven, free versions. They will keep on developing. Another one will be a vendor control, because they will realize that some of the very niche business areas require a very strong vendor control. And third would be an intersection of them. Now, it is again a reassuring factor for me as an open source user that I have a whole lot of choices to pick from, which something the other alternatives may not be in a position to offer you. These are some of the countries. It's again dated 2011, so we are almost technically getting into 2013, so we can say it's 2 years old. The thing is, all the countries in the red have a very favorable response for the open source. They have very friendly laws and regulation. And assuming 2 years from now, there'll be a lot more reds over there. Some of the examples are where of promoting open source, maybe for a wrong reason. By wrong reason, I mean they promote open source to break the stronghold of any particular closed source vendor. It's kind of a philosophy, eye for an eye, make the whole world blind. So tomorrow, if there is, assuming, theoretically, if there is another alternative from open source, then they will promote that to kill the open source. So that is not what actually the government should be looking for. Little broad though, but the idea here is that choose open source for the things it stands for, not just to kill anybody else. That was for the government. And this is for the corporates. These are some rules of engagement. We divide them into level 0 to 5. The first one is where you do not engage with the community and just keep using some form of open source. But you keep on submitting the feature request and the defect reports. When you go a little bit more mature and get used to the open source functioning, you start submitting the defect resolutions, which just you used to report till now. The level 3 comes in when you submit the features which you have developed because you are using the open source over a period of time. The level 4 would be where you take a responsibility for some part of a project to be led by you because you have attained that kind of expertise on the open source and you feel good to do it. The final, level 5 would be where you actually start leading a large initiative or a project. And that is the rules of engagement that is very easier to understand, very easier to be tracked as well. From the governance maturity model, we have reiterated that again and again, that why governance is so important for any organization if they want to control the open source and get the profitability as expected. It starts from level 1 to 5. The level 1 is a very ad hoc basis usage of open source, any open source solution. The level 2 would be the repeatability of it. Now, since you have demonstrated the success of open source, you are in a position to repeat that again and again. Level 3 would be the defining part of it, where you draw the lines, the guidelines of open source usage, do's and don'ts, the best practices. Level 4 would be the cost optimization, where you actually start rolling it out on the entire enterprise basis, and you get the same degree of TCO and ROI as expected. 5 will be the innovation part. And these will keep on changing. It is like a concept of Kaizen, that improvement, continuous improvement. If we have to club it, leaving the level 1, level 2 and 3 is required to run the business. Level 3 and 4 in combination is required to grow the business, and the fourth is innovation, as we know of. If you look at India, we are growing by 20 to 30% year over year. That's quite a fast growth. We do understand it is from a granular base though, but the percentage of growth is extremely high. The government and the public sector, academics, SMBs are all driving the demand. So there is always a demand and supply kind of thing which we keep hearing. So despite the fact there is a huge demand, what is happening at the back end from the supply side? So there is a whole lot of growing ecosystem of dedicated system integrators and service providers. But dedicated, I am not talking about the TCS, which also does open source, or Wipro, which also provides open source services. But these are the ones which work on the pure open source technologies. And they have successfully demonstrated a large, complex implementations. A lot of retailers in India are actually using these services for some of the solutions which are very, very inherent to them because of their unique business practices. The future opportunities are going to come from e-governance, cloud, and all the emerging paradigms of media, mobility, big data. However, some of the communities which have set up a base in India, they find lack of code contribution as a challenge. It could be either because we are new to it and we really haven't given the kind of attention it requires. But they are not really worried because the kind of ecosystem we have, the kind of developers we have, it is just a matter of time when that challenge is going to get addressed. Some of the examples where in unique ID, it is intended to be leveraged very, very heavily. Others are a successful demonstration of open source already. The government has been using it for IT school projects. In Punjab, it has been using it for education. LMS had been a very successful in Gujarat, while as Meghdoot is a CDAP project on cloud. It doesn't really stop there. We have a whole lot of private, small, large corporate houses which had been using open source successfully. And they are the ones who actually have a very strong governance as well. And they have understood how to really leverage open source for a larger good. Finally, I'm on the recommendation side that understand that open source is unavoidable. It's not a public or a shareware. It is not equal to the open standards. The success of open source hinges on the freedom and choice. There is no single entity which owns it. Your mileage, your ROI may vary from case to case, and be open for that. It represents both benefit and the danger like any other software. It impacts market differently. And finally, it is evolving like any other technology. As an action plan, or as a quick action plan, which is immediate thing which we need to do is that take an inventory check, take a look at the software assets which you already have in your organization. Because we highly base our assumption on the fact that 99% chances are you will already be having some kind of open source. In the next 90 days, which is like a quarter, make the hierarchy of management or the relevant management aware about the things they need to know about open source. Formulate a plan in terms of governance that how you want to navigate leveraging open source in your organization. And in the next 12 months, keep evaluating, keep going back that what you implemented and what is the outcome. With this, I finally conclude this presentation. And there are some other related Gartner research. Should you require more insight, you're always free to read them. With this, I thank you, everyone, and thanks for paying attention, despite the fact I was a little groggy. But thanks once again, everyone. I'm open for questions and answers. I'm here for an entire day. So whenever you feel like, we can connect on this open source. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Asheesh. Any questions? If you'd like to raise, you can do that now.
Hi Asheesh, I'm Shankar from Axis Capital. My question to you is, during this study, you have used the qualitative approach. The quantitative approach is missing, So what could be the reason? Can you quantify the growth, the ROI using this open source Red Hat?
Okay, so one of the reasons why we haven't gone for quantifiable data is it could be misleading. Now, if I have to compare the absolute numbers, they sometimes seem to be much lower. Say, for example, India market would be today for open source would be somewhere around 5 to 6 million. And it is very small when we compare to any proprietary software market. So that is misleading. So it doesn't mean that the number of users are small. Numbers of users are actually more, but it is just that the acquisition cost is low. The numbers come down. So that is one of the reasons to avoid it. Secondly, again, in terms of ROI, we avoid it because they keep on changing. So it again becomes a misleading. So every time there is open source which is being used in any particular scenario, it may not give the same result. And it is true for closed source also. But we are a little watchful about open source because it becomes a very misleading thing. So we are in a stage we are fighting some kind of misconceptions around it. We are fighting not so practically based approaches. So we refrain from putting the numbers. But if you want, we have numbers where we had done a forecasting globally, and we had done a forecasting in each vertical in terms of software segmentation, how it will grow in cloud, how it will go in. But again, that is more in percentages, like CAGRs. So maybe if I can send it to the representative of Red Hat, and you can collect it from them, if that addresses your purpose. All right, seems good. And thank you so much once again, and enjoy the rest of the day.